Queen Blanche lost her husband at a very young age. She was left with a small child who was heir to the throne of France in the middle of the 13th century. She had to take on the governance of a kingdom. And Blanche was a good woman, a holy woman. She truly loved the Lord, very inspired by the Franciscans. She joined the Third Order, did much to help the Franciscan order, but she also herself really embraced a life of true simplicity of heart. She built many hospitals for the poor and for the needy. She took care of the sick, and sometimes with her own hands she would care for the poor. The throne did not separate her from the people. She saw her place as queen to be really a place of service. She raised her young son Louis in the same manner. Very concerned and most concerned for his salvation, she saw to it that the friars would teach him the faith and teach him well, that he would truly learn not just the faith up here, but down here, that he would be taught to truly love God, that he would come to fall in love with God, that he would love God so much that he would not even ever want to commit any sin. Louis was very impressed by his mother. He was totally embracing of everything she taught him. And one day she said to him, "I would rather you die than you commit even one mortal sin." She saw sin as so horrifying that she'd never want her son to ever be cut off from God, that she'd rather him dead in the glory of heaven than to ever offend God. Of course, little Louis, this little kid, was very impressed by what his mother said, and so he committed himself never to commit a mortal sin. And it said that Louis never lost his baptismal innocence, that he maintained a strong life of holiness. He was 12 years old when he was crowned king, but his mother was really in charge. He was kind of just ceremoniously in charge until he was about 17, 18. But his mother was kind of running operations. And during that time, Louis himself joined the Third Order of St. Francis and really set his heart on being a holy, good king. He married in that time. Eventually, he and his wife had 11 children, 11 kids as king. He had to govern a kingdom and a household of 11. And he was a wonderful king. Oftentimes, he was out there serving the poor himself. He always dressed simply, never with a fancifulness. He would rather spend more money on the poor than on himself. Really caring for the faith. He was able to convince the Holy Father to allow him to bring the crown of thorns that crowned our Lord on Calvary to France. And he built a special chapel for the crown of thorns so that the people of France could always remember the passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ, and how much they were worth to God, how much they were loved by God. He was a good man. He was a good king. I forget where it was said that they said it's hard for a good man to be a good king, right? Because of the trappings of the power, the trappings of all that comes with it, the trappings of the money. And Louis never allowed that to get in his way of governing. It didn't allure him. What he cared most about was pleasing God and caring for his people, particularly the poorest among them. He built houses and homes for the poor to make sure that nobody in his kingdom would ever be without a home. And he made sure that they were fed. He so loved the faith that when the Muslims had taken over Jerusalem and were killing people by the sword, if they didn't convert, he himself led an army to try to free Jerusalem and free the people. He was taken captive. A plague broke out and all of his men were sick, and in their weakness they were taken captive. He was held prisoner by the Muslims for several months. He was told that if he denied Christ, embraced the Muslim faith, he could go free. And he simply looked at his jailers and said, "I'd rather die than deny Christ." Eventually they freed him and he returned home, continued his kingship after his mother had passed. That's why he went home to bury his mother, but truly a good man and a good king. He wrote letters to his children, telling his children to love the Lord, never to sin, to put God first in their lives, that when they were to take over the throne in the kingdom, to be sure that the faith would always be an essential part of the kingdom of France. And that was just something that came from his own heart. talk to his children about the beauty of the Holy Mass and receiving Holy Communion. This is a king, but a man whose first understanding was that he was not simply the king, he was simply the Lord's steward of France. He was the Lord's steward, and he was to see to it that his people understood that Jesus Christ was truly the King of Kings and the Lord of all, and he was merely the steward of the Lord. He went to visit his troops one day who was sick. A plague had broke out similar to our own day, perhaps even much worse than our own day. They didn't even have the medicine we have today to even care for half of what happened. And Louis did not allow that to stop him from being charitable. The love of his heart for his people drew him out of the castle to the sick and the suffering. And when he was visiting his sick soldiers, tending to them, caring for them, he himself fell ill of the plague and died of the plague. A good patron for today's day and age, that we pray to his intercession for the end of this plague, but also for our healthcare workers who care for plague victims. St. Louis may have been king, but he saw that his first responsibility was with his own hands to care for his people, nursing them, caring for them, even to the risk of his own life, and in fact gave his life in service of his people, not from a throne, but from a hospital room, from the bedside. The virtue of charity was something that reigned in his heart. Charity reigned over his heart as king. St. Louis is the patron of the Franciscan Third Order because he was such an incredible man of the order, but it was his charity that did it. His love of God that allowed his heart to grow into charity, that he would not allow anyone ever to undergo any kind of thing that he himself wouldn't first go and care for them. He's a good example for us today, I think, to think about the charity of God, the kindness of God, but also the importance that faith should take the first priority in our families, in our homes. That our homes should be places of prayer. Our homes should be places where Christ is known and loved. Our homes should be places where when people walk in, they know that it's God's home. Every father, every mother of a family is really the steward of the Lord, and should also lead their children, their family, to the goodness of God. I go back to those words that St. Louis was told by his mother, that he should prefer death over sin. Words that he would repeat to his own son in one of his letters, telling his son who would take the throne from him that he should rather die than ever commit a mortal sin. It's something to think and contemplate in our lives when we think about how easily we sometimes fall to sin, how easily sin can take hold of our hearts. That when we start feeling tempted by sin, we start getting distracted by it, the allurements of it, and all that it pulls us towards, to take a step back and say, no, I'd rather die than commit sin. I'd rather be in the glory of the kingdom of heaven than even to offend God just a little bit, because he's so good and so worthy of all my love. So today, whatever you take from this little story of the life of this incredible king, take it to heart and, allow St. Louis to intercede for each of us, that in our lives we always set Christ first, allow Christ to rule over us, and that we may never, ever turn to sin, but always choose, the glory of God before all else. May God bless you, and Merry Christmas.